The radios were popping. The concrete vibrated with a low mechanical hum, and the steel door at the end of the service corridor slid open 3 inches without a single command. Cheyenne Mountain was never silent, but that night the noise felt wrong. The guard on rotation, Mason Hale, noted the temperature drop first. A draft, thin as a thread, slipped along the floor from the direction of blast door C17. The door was supposed to be sealed, magnetically locked, and monitored by 2 independent sensors. Yet its status light blinked in an irregular pattern, like a pulse losing rhythm. He walked the length of the gray corridor with his flashlight angled low. The beam shimmered against dust that shouldn't exist in a filtered facility. The deeper he went, the more he noticed the discrepancies. A vibration underfoot that didn't match any scheduled system cycles. A faint odor of coolant, even though maintenance logs showed no active repairs, and the persistent tick in his earpiece as if comms were brushing against interference. Hale keyed the control panel beside C17. The interface lagged, then displayed a fault code he had never seen. It didn't describe a malfunction, only a timestamp. The timestamp matched the moment he stepped off the elevator onto level F. The system was timestamping him. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It slid another inch, enough to reveal a thin line of darkness inside. No lights, no sounds, nothing moving. Just a large, sealed compartment that, according to the architectural map, had been decommissioned in 1998 and converted into a redundant storage chamber. He had passed it for years without ever seeing it unlocked. Hale leaned closer. The darkness had depth to it, as though the room extended farther than its layout should allow. He tapped his radio. Static snapped back. Not just the ordinary kind. This static rolled in small bursts, almost patterned, flickering with pauses that reminded him of slow Morse. He stepped back instinctively. He checked the corridor cameras. Both feeds for C17 were frozen on loop, replaying a 2-second image of the empty hallway. The footage stuttered at the same place each time, right before the door moved. Hale opened the maintenance binder mounted to the wall, tracing the registry for C17. It listed 13 sensor nodes. Only 12 responded. The missing one had last pinged 21 years earlier, reporting a temperature anomaly of -6 degrees in a room that had no active refrigeration. The file ended without a follow-up. A low thud sounded from somewhere beyond the bulkhead distant, softened by layers of metal, like something shifting its weight. Hale froze. No personnel were authorized inside C17. No equipment was scheduled, and nothing inside should have been powered. When he reached the door again, it wasn't cracked open 3 inches anymore. It was open 6. He felt the draft intensify, rolling across his boots, carrying a faint metallic scent. He turned on his flashlight, but the beam seemed to dissolve at the threshold, swallowed before it reached the opposite wall. The air itself looked denser, like heat distortion, but cold. A quiet rattling echoed from the overhead conduit. Hale stepped back, scanning the ceiling. The conduit vibrated once, then stopped, leaving the hallway in a heavy, unnatural stillness. He realized he hadn't heard ventilation for nearly a minute, as if the airflow had been cut only in this wing. He tried to force the door closed, digging his fingers into the steel edge. It resisted him. Not mechanically. It should have glided shut, but as though something on the other side displaced the pressure. The more he pushed, the more he felt an opposing force, soft but deliberate, like air pressing back. His radio crackled sharply. A single clipped tone burst through, the same frequency used for emergency override. He raised the device, expecting command to break through the interference. Instead, a slow, dragging scrape carried through the channel, as if something heavy was being moved across a distant floor. Then the signal cut. Hale turned toward the elevator. The lights overhead dimmed, flickered once, then stabilized. When he looked back at C-17, the door was shut, fully sealed, locked, status light steady green. His pulse hammered. He stepped forward and pressed the control panel again. No fault code, no timestamp, no delay. The system behaved as if nothing had happened. But the dust trail on the floor told a different story. It traced a faint arc from the threshold outward, curling toward the center of the corridor before fading, like something had stepped out and then stopped, deciding where to go next. Hale reached down and ran his finger through the dust. The particles clung to his glove, colder than the surrounding air. Behind him, the cameras rebooted with a sharp click, resuming real-time feed. When he checked the monitors, the footage showed him standing alone, the corridor empty, the door unmoved, except his own shadow on the floor didn't match his posture. In the monitor, his shadow leaned slightly forward, as if peering into C-17, even though he was standing upright, facing the screen. He backed away from the monitors in a slow, controlled movement. He didn't turn his back to the door. He didn't speak into the radio again. He simply walked toward the elevator with the sense that something in the air behind him shifted, adjusting to the absence of light. As the elevator doors closed, he caught a final glimpse down the corridor. C-17's status light flickered once, then held steady, its green glow pulsing faintly like breath. The elevator rattled as it climbed, each floor passing with a muted clunk that sounded deeper than usual. Hale watched the numbers rise, but the carriage felt slower, as if the counterweights were dragging through syrup. When the doors opened on level E, the ambient noise was stronger ventilation steady, servers humming, people moving. Normalcy washed over him like a thin, brittle film. He walked directly to the auxiliary monitoring station. The operator on duty, Rourke, sat with headphones on, reviewing seismic readouts. Hale waited for him to lift one ear. "You feel something?" Rourke asked without looking up. Whole lower wing twitched about 5 minutes ago. Hale scanned the displays. A minor spike, localized. The epicenter sat directly beneath C-17. Thought that area was retired. Rourke said, tapping the screen. Sensors there are ancient. Half of them report garbage when the humidity drops. Hale kept his voice level. Any access logs for the maintenance tunnels near F level? Rourke swiveled to another console. Last authorized entry was 3 weeks ago. 2 electricians swapped a junction plate. No one since. Hale leaned over the map. The maintenance tunnels formed a tight grid beneath Cheyenne Mountain, but one rectangular Zone F East Sub-3 showed no active telemetry. The block was grayed out, tagged as decommissioned, yet its coordinates aligned with C-17's bulkhead. "Can you pull internal temperature for that sector?" Hale asked. Rourke tried. The console hesitated, then populated with a series of dashes. Offline. He tried again. Same result. Everything in that section's dead. Power, sensors, cams. If something kicked on, we'd see a draw. But there's nothing. Hal felt the low mechanical rumble again. Not in the floor this time, but in his memory, subtle, misplaced, rhythmic. He checked the timestamp of the seismic spike. It occurred 26 seconds after he stepped in front of C-17. He left the station without further explanation. Rourke called after him, asking if he needed backup, but Hale shook his head and continued down the hall. He moved quickly through Level E, past the cum nodes and servo cages, until he reached a restricted doorway marked Structural Archives, Authorized Staff Only. He keyed in and slipped inside. The archive room smelled of warm plastic and old paper. Rows of flat files held original construction schematics, decades of layered modifications sealed in dustproof sleeves. Hale pulled the plans for Sublevel F and snapped them onto the lightboard. The sheet was neat, labeled, and complete, except for one tiny irregularity. The corridor leading to C-17 was drawn with slightly darker ink. Not newer, not older, just different enough to catch light oddly. He leaned closer. The corridor was listed as a retrofit from 1998. He flipped to the 1997 plans. No corridor, no room, no designation C-17. He checked 1999. C-17 appeared again, but its square footage didn't match the previous drawing. It was off by several meters, shifted subtly east. Hale pulled the 2003 revisions. The room had been reduced again, reclassified as redundant archive storage, though the facility had no record of such an archive. He laid the sheets side by side. The dimensions changed, but the outer wall lines remained identical. Only the internal borders moved, shapes collapsing in on themselves, shrinking, repositioning. As though the architects redrew the interior multiple times without ever accessing the physical space. A cold ripple moved across the boards. Hale turned off the light board and rolled the plans back into the drawer. His pulse steadied with practiced control, but his hands remained tense. As he exited the archives, the overhead lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the hallway ahead to flatten into silhouettes. When the lights returned, Hale noticed a single footprint on the polished floor. Dust, faint, heel to toe, leading toward the stairwell that descended back to F level. The print didn't match his boots. Too narrow, too long, and it appeared only once, without any leading or trailing marks, as if something had been standing there, and then simply moved on without taking a second step. Hale followed the direction of the print. When he reached the stairwell door, he pressed his palm to the metal. It was cold. Not chilled by air conditioning cold, but subterranean cold, like stone that hadn't seen warmth in years. He opened the door and started down the stairs. Each flight took him deeper into the heart of the facility, where the mechanical sounds faded and the concrete absorbed the echo of his steps. When he reached F level, the temperature dropped sharply. A thin layer of condensation clung to the handrail. He stepped into the hallway. 100 to 17 was closed, but the dust trail he had brushed earlier was gone. The floor was clean, polished, undisturbed, as if someone had wiped it with industrial precision. He approached the door. No fault code, no flicker, no draft. Then, somewhere inside the sealed room, metal shifted soft, slow, dragging along the floor. Hale stepped back, his breath shallow, his hand drifting toward the emergency beacon on his belt. A second sound followed, not movement. A single hollow knock from the inside. The knock echoed once, then folded into the walls like the concrete absorbed it. Hale stayed still, counting his breaths, measuring the weight of the silence that followed. The air felt heavier than before, dense enough that each inhale carried the faint metallic chill he had sensed earlier. The status light beside the door glowed steady green, the system insisting that nothing inside was active. He crouched to inspect the lower seal. A thin thread of frost lined the edge, so faint it looked like someone had traced the metal with an iced fingertip. He touched it. The cold bit into his glove. Further down the hall, the overhead fixtures buzzed in a staggered rhythm. One flickered, then another. The pulses weren't random. They seemed to travel the length of the corridor like a slow wave. Hale stepped back and pressed his radio to his shoulder. "Control, this is Hale on F level. I need static consume the rest. Not harsh, not loud soft, steady, with intermittent drops in volume, like the signal was breathing between syllables." He stopped talking. The static continued on its own for 3 seconds, matching the cadence of his earlier words. He turned off the radio. A low vibration moved under the floor, subtle but consistent, drawing his attention toward the far end of the corridor, where a maintenance grate sat flush with the base of the wall. The screws were old, dulled by decades of filtered air. As Hale approached, He saw that one screw was turning slow, grain by grain backing itself out without a tool, unwinding in tiny fractional movements. He knelt beside it, watching the metal rotate with painstaking precision. A slight draft pushed through the grate, cold enough to sting his eyes. He pressed his palm to the vent. The airflow was steady, directional, like something deeper inside the structure was shifting atmospheric pressure. He stepped back. The screw stopped turning. His attention shifted to a faint sound behind him, a clink of metal touching metal. Hull rotated slowly. C-17's status light had turned amber. Not flashing, not warning. Holding a steady, unnatural hue that didn't match any of the standard facility indicators. He checked the control panel. No diagnostics. No alerts. The system was behaving correctly, even though the light was impossible. A soft hum rose from inside the sealed room. The kind of hum produced by old fluorescent tubes warming up. Except the interior wasn't wired for lighting anymore. Everything inside should have been gutted years earlier. Hale moved to the wall-mounted intercom. He pressed the call button. C-17 interior. This is Security Hale. If someone is inside, respond. Only the hum answered. Then the hum cut off abruptly. Silence returned, but not the same silence. This one carried subtle texture, faint pops of static, tiny shifts in air pressure, the signs of an enclosed space adjusting to a new equilibrium. He pressed his ear to the steel. Nothing. He took one step back. Something inside tapped the door again. Not with knuckles, something softer. A controlled, deliberate pressure that pushed outward for just a second before releasing. The steel flexed by an almost imperceptible margin. Hale's breath caught. That door was built to withstand a blast. Nothing inside should have been capable of moving it even a fraction. He keyed into the hallway's emergency interface. The system required two-factor access for forced entry. He initiated the first stage. Green light. He swiped his ID. Yellow light. He reached for the final biometric confirmation. Then the panel shut off. The entire hallway went dark. The ventilation stilled. The air tightened and cooled in a single downward shift, like pressure was suddenly being siphoned through unseen seams. He stood motionless in the black, hands open, waiting for his eyes to adjust. Tiny electronic ticks echoed from the conduit's overhead slow, irregular, shifting position. When the emergency lights snapped on, they glowed a dim red wash across the corridor. C-17 stood ahead of him, door unchanged, amber light steady. But the floor right in front of it was wet, a thin patch of condensation spreading outward like something thawing from the inside. Hale crouched, touched the moisture, and brought his fingers close to his face. No smell, no film, just chilled water. He wiped his hand on his uniform and stood. Somewhere above, something metallic struck the ceiling panel with a sharp ping, then another. Two separate impacts, evenly spaced, as if stones had fallen straight down the ventilation shaft and hit metal before settling. He stared up at the ceiling. The panels were steady. No vibration, no movement. When he looked back at C-17, the amber light was gone. The status light was off entirely. Not green, not red, just dark. Hale exhaled slowly, the cold air visible in front of him. Then the door opened 1 inch on its own, not sliding, not glitching, just easing outward, so slowly it barely made a sound. The inch of darkness behind the door looked thicker than before, as though the space beyond had compressed. Hale kept his hands still at his sides, resisting the urge to reach for his sidearm. He listened. No hum, no dripping, no mechanical cycling. Just the dense, static-laced quiet that always preceded a pressure change. Another inch opened, slow, careful, controlled. The hydraulics didn't engage. The mechanism stayed dead. The steel moved as if pushed from the inside by a steady, measured force. Cold air spilled across his boots. Hale stepped backward until his shoulder blades met the opposite wall. He tilted his head just enough to check the corridor cameras above him. Both lenses were fixed straight ahead, diodes blinking green. Operational. But the tiny reflection in the glass showed a slight misalignment, a low, creeping smear across the feed, as if the hallway lights were warping in a subtle downward curve. He moved back toward the door. Inside the widening gap, something shifted in the air, the faintest distortion, a ripple-like heat rising off desert asphalt, but colder, spiraling inward rather than up. His flashlight beam again dissolved past the threshold. The light didn't spring back. It just vanished. He leaned closer. A faint scuff sounded deeper inside, not footsteps, more like fabric brushing against metal. A slow shuffle, then stillness. He keyed the panel again, even knowing it was dead. No response. He slid his fingers along the edge of the door and felt the temperature drop sharply. Frost clung in small granular patches to the inside seam. He whispered, barely audible, "Is someone in there?" No voice answered, but something shifted its weight. He stepped away. At the far end of the hallway, the maintenance grate he had examined earlier clicked once, then again. A tap from behind it, light but intentional. The airflow reversed, pulling inward like the corridor was exhaling toward C-17. Hall turned just enough to check behind him while keeping the door in sight. The faint footprint from the previous level flashed through his mind. The single step, no origin, no trail. He checked the floor now. Nothing disturbed. But the condensation near the door had grown, thin lines spreading like veins. He returned to the doorway and leaned in just enough for his flashlight to catch the far wall. It didn't catch anything, because the wall wasn't there. The beam found no back surface, no shelving, no internal partition. The room, originally only 12 feet deep, now extended into an opaque void that swallowed every photon. His breathing steadied with effort. A metal object clattered softly inside the darkness. Hale flinched, not backward, but forward, instinct driving him toward identification. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and raised it low. The object rolled to a stop just beyond the threshold. A badge. He crouched, careful not to cross the seam, and angled the light. The badge belonged to a R. Wilcox clearance level 4. Missing since 2002, the last recorded person ever assigned to C-17. The badge was clean, not aged, no dust, no corrosion, as though it had been set down minutes earlier. Hale reached out but stopped. A draft brushed the back of his neck. Not cold, warm, brief, like someone standing behind him had just exhaled. He straightened and pivoted in one sharp motion. No one stood there. The corridor lay empty, red emergency lights washing everything in a muted glow. The air held still. Then the radios and the maintenance cabinets along the wall all clicked on at once. Not broadcasting voices broadcasting the same soft static he heard earlier. But this time the static pulsed slow. Measured, 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause, repeating, like acknowledgement. The corridor lights flickered in response, dimming on the pulses. Hale turned back toward the open door. The badge was gone. No sound, no movement, just absence. He stepped back until he felt concrete behind him again. Every instinct screamed to seal the door, lock it, move away. But the moment he reached for the emergency lever, something inside C-17 responded an upward draft, sudden, forceful, spiraling out of the doorway like pressure from a rising elevator shaft. The door shuddered. Metal groaned, not from the hinges, but from deeper inside the room, like a support beam bending under slow, deliberate strain. The amber light snapped back on for half a second bright enough to flash against his eyes, then died again. The door slid another inch open, without noise, until the gap reached a full hand width. Cold rolled out, deliberate and steady. Then the corridor lights stabilized. Something in the room shifted forward. Not seen, not heard, felt, like mass displacing air. Like a presence moving closer to the threshold without crossing it. Hale backed away, heartbeat steady, eyes fixed on the widening darkness. The cold pressing from the open seam felt directional now, not drifting but focused, as if the air inside the chamber were flowing around an object Hale couldn't see. He steadied his breathing and forced himself 2 steps closer, stopping just short of the threshold. The dark interior carried a smell he hadn't noticed before, dry, metallic, almost like an empty data vault that hadn't been opened in decades. He angled the flashlight downward. The floor inside looked unchanged at first glance, smooth concrete, faint grooves from equipment that once sat there. But the light caught irregular shadows, shallow impressions that formed a loose pattern. Not footprints, not tire tracks. More like weight points, as if heavy objects had rested there, then shifted slightly between readings. He traced the pattern with the beam. The indentations grew deeper the farther they extended into the void, gradually disappearing where the light failed. He leaned sideways, trying to catch any sign of depth or structure, but the darkness absorbed the beam with unnatural efficiency. Behind him, one of the maintenance cabinet radios emitted a short burst, 3 clicks, ascending. Hal froze. The clicks repeated, this time slower. He turned, scanning each cabinet. All were closed. All were locked. Yet the sound inside them didn't echo like electronics. It had a dampened, physical quality, like a small object striking metal. He faced the doorway again. The air shifted. Not a breeze, an adjustment. A recalibration of temperature and pressure that made his eardrums tighten. He swallowed against the discomfort, but it didn't ease. He tapped his jaw lightly, expecting relief, but the sensation only deepened, like something on the other side of the wall was creating a vacuum that pulled the equilibrium out of the corridor. The emergency lights flickered, just once. A blink, and in that blink, Hale saw a silhouette. A figure, standing 15 feet inside the room. When the light steadied, the silhouette vanished. He stepped backward, pulse even but fast. He checked the floor, no new footprints. No drag marks. No smears of condensation. Nothing that could indicate movement. He rechecked the spot inside the door. No sign, no shape, no reflection. Only darkness. Hale raised his radio again and clicked once silent code for location check. If anyone was monitoring, protocol required an immediate acknowledgement tone. No tone returned. Instead, the static rose again, this time faintly modulated, forming a thin oscillation that fell into a repeating interval. Not random. A cycle, consistent and slow, almost matching the rhythm of a respiration pattern. Something below the corridor thudded once, deep and distant. A structural echo, heavy enough to vibrate the door frame. Hale braced himself. The thud stopped. A moment later, a second thud responded, slightly closer. He checked the ceiling, once more, panels unmoving, secure. He checked the floor dry, except for the condensation pooled along the seam. He checked the door open, 6 inches now. He hadn't seen it move. He reached toward the door with the back of his knuckles, closing in slowly until he nearly touched the seam. The metal trembled under his hand. Not violently, not enough to make noise. Just a faint, rapid vibration, like a machine idling behind thick walls. He dropped his hand. Inside the darkness, something small clinked against concrete. Once, then rolled. The sound faded into the distance as though the room extended far deeper than its schematics allowed. Hale tightened his grip on the flashlight and made a decision he immediately questioned. He leaned into the doorway and swept the beam across the left wall. The wall wasn't there. Concrete met emptiness. the edge of the beam cutting across what should have been a solid boundary. He stepped back. His throat tightened. He tried the right wall. Also gone. C-17 had changed shape again. A third thud echoed this time overhead, running a vibration down the walls and into the floor. Dust shook loose from a conduit bracket, sprinkling down in a soft scatter. Hale looked up. The ceiling above the doorway had developed a hairline crack, thin as a pencil line, extending slowly toward the center of the hall. He took another step back. The pressure in the air increased, making the skin along his arms tighten. Then, without warning, the corridor lights surged bright white for half a second, overriding the emergency red, and during that brief glare, Hale saw the silhouette again. Closer, standing just inside the seam, still and tall, its outline sharp against the sudden light. When the brightness cut back to red, the silhouette was gone. The draft reversed again, warm air pushing out of the doorway now, as if the interior pressure had flipped polarity. A faint sound followed. Breathing, not his. Steady, slow, barely audible, but unmistakably in the same space. He forced himself to retreat a full 4 steps. Inside the room, something shifted forward, displacing a small cloud of dust that drifted across the threshold, catching the emergency light like tiny sparks. And then, just as Hall reached for the emergency seal lever, the door slid shut. Rapid, smooth, final. The status light blinked green. The corridor returned to normal lighting. The temperature normalized. The ventilation resumed. Everything reset, except for one detail. Hale looked down. Another footprint had appeared in front of the door. Not the one from earlier. This one pointed toward him. The new footprint held its shape perfectly heel deep, toe light, edges crisp, as if whoever made it had paused before stepping back. Hale crouched slowly, studying the pattern. Same size as the earlier one. Same narrow profile. Same impossible singularity. No lead-in from the corridor. No dust disturbed around it. A single step taken by something that hadn't been standing there a second earlier. The lights above him steadied. Brighter now, the red emergency wash replaced by cold fluorescence. The hallway looked normal. The temperature normal. The door sealed. The systems quiet. But the air had weight. He straightened and approached the control panel again. This time, it responded instantly, no lag, no false timestamp. Access logs displayed clean. The last recorded interaction showed Hale closing the door himself. A lie, precise and clean. He opened the secondary diagnostics. The system showed no amber light event, no door movement, no power fluctuation, no record of the corridor blackout. The seismic spike from earlier was also gone, replaced with a flat line that suggested the data had been overwritten or purged. Hale moved back from the panel. A soft click echoed from the ceiling. Then another. The same pattern he had heard inside the radios. A slow, deliberate interval. He scanned the overhead panels again. One of them, 15 feet from the door, had dropped a fraction of an inch on one corner, barely noticeable unless he squinted. He pulled his flashlight and angled the beam across the surface. A thin line of condensation clung to the metal, tracing a narrow curve like something had pressed against it from the inside of the ventilation duct. The moisture trailed across the panel, dripping once onto the floor. Hale stepped back. A second drip followed. Then something tapped inside the duct. Not a scrape, not a shift. A tap, light and intentional, like knuckles brushing metal. He turned toward the stairwell, scanning for movement. Nothing. Just the hum of the facility, steady and calm. He moved quickly, descending one flight to widen distance between him and the duct. But halfway down, he stopped. A sound rose from below. A slow, rolling creak of metal poured into concrete. Not from the duct, not from the walls. From the levels beneath C-17, Halde descended 2 more flights, boots echoing against the narrow stairwell. The air thickened again, not cold this time, but still, as though he was walking into a pocket of unmoving atmosphere. He reached the landing where the old schematics had shown a sealed sub-corridor Feast Sub-3, the one with no power readings, no telemetry, no access logs for decades. A fresh maintenance lockout plate covered the door, newer than everything around it, untouched by dust, untouched by time. The bolts were tight, the surface clean, the tag dated 2 weeks ago. But Hale knew every scheduled lockdown for the past 6 months. None included this door. He reached out and touched the metal. Warm. A thud sounded behind it. Not large. Not heavy. Close. He backed away and lifted his radio again. "Control, this is Hale. I need..." The radio clicked once, then a second time. His own silent code, repeated back to him. He lowered the device with slow precision, pulse steady but hard. Another thud answered from behind the sealed door. Then a second, a third, spaced evenly, rhythmic, matching the pulses he had heard in the corridor, matching the intervals from the radios, matching the ceiling taps. He stepped farther back into the stairwell. Metal slid inside the wall, a bolt turning, then another, then silence. Hale gripped the railing, breath tight in his chest. The lockout plate remained still, but the air around it shifted. A pressure change, subtle but definite, pushing outward. He took another step back. Above him, far up the staircase, something moved across the landing, soft, slow, deliberate. Something that hadn't been there a moment earlier. Hale froze. The movement paused. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. The air stayed still for several long seconds. Then a faint, distorted reflection appeared on the metal of the lockout plate, just a smear of shadow, bending slightly, as if someone stood behind him on the landing above, watching without stepping into view. Hale tightened his grip on the railing and began to ascend, one step at a time, keeping his eyes fixed on the plate until he reached the next turn in the stairs. He looked up. Nothing stood there. Nothing moved. The floor was empty. But the faint condensation trail across the landing showed where something had paused. He climbed until he reached level E again, breath controlled, steps measured. The hallway felt warmer now, normal, almost comfortable. People moved in the distance. Doors hissed open and closed. Life at Cheyenne Mountain carried on, as if nothing beneath them had changed. Hale reached the elevator. Before stepping inside, he looked once more toward the stairwell door. The lights dimmed. Just for a second. Just long enough for a shadow to appear at the bottom of the stairwell. Tall, still, looking up. The lights brightened. The shadow was gone. Hall entered the elevator and watched the doors close. He didn't descend again that night. And C-17 was locked down by morning with a new directive. Area sealed pending structural review. No personnel entry. No one mentioned unusual readings. No one mentioned missing logs. No one mentioned Wilcox's badge. But over the next week, Hale noticed something. Every time he walked past a hallway camera, the live feed showed his shadow leaning forward, always facing a door behind him, always waiting for it to open.